I'm really very excited to be here, in part because finally I'll be able to give the R-rated version of this talk, which means that I've had to rewrite it considerably, and we'll be reading some of it, breaking some of the rules of public speaking, but just imagine, if you will, that this is the Democratic National Convention and there's a teleprompter and that I'm making eye contact with all of you while I'm speaking. I'm a native New Yorker. I was born and raised in Middletown, New York. Actually taught at Columbia University for a couple of years, worked at the Rockefeller Foundation, spent several years working for the Clinton-Gore administration at the Department of Energy, been blogging for the last 6 years, and as Julian mentioned, I'm working with James Cameron and some former 60 Minutes producers to actually do a TV series. It will be a TV mini-series, maybe 6 to 8 hours on Showtime, and it will come out in about a year, and I think it'll be very exciting. And today, however, I'm here to try to persuade you to buy my book, Language Intelligence, Lessons on Persuasion from Jesus, Shakespeare, Lincoln, and Lady Gaga. Now, I should say that is normally the goal of my talk, but since my mother is here, she will be at the table. She will hawk the book, and I don't have to try to persuade you to buy my book. I just have to try to persuade you to talk to her. And if she can't persuade you to buy the book, then Jesus, Shakespeare, Lincoln, and Lady Gaga combined could not. I will still need to persuade you to read the book once you buy it, because Lord knows we all buy a lot of books that we don't read anymore. And Van Jones, who's a great progressive communicator and a CNN analyst, gave me a great jacket quote for the book. This book changed my life, and it can change your life too. I do think that this book could change your life, but of course you'll have to buy it and read it first. Now, to figure out who in the audience could have their life changed by this book, I will ask one simple question. How many people here have ever read a book or taken a course in how to be more persuasive and memorable using the figures of speech? Wow. Well, it's really amazing, since I had been assured that you were the literati of New York City, and hence the world. But the proven secrets of persuasion, of being persuasive and memorable, are not even taught to the best and brightest anymore, even though we spend more of our waking hours trying to be persuasive and memorable than anything else we do. It's as if the physics students at MIT and Columbia didn't get taught calculus. And I say proven because modern social science research has confirmed that the figures of speech are indeed the key to being persuasive and memorable. And I try to sprinkle the science throughout the book because I am a recovering physicist. And by that I mean I spent the second half of my life unlearning much of what I learned in the first half. Because I was thinking about it, that the three main things you learn about communications in science, and I think a lot of higher education, is 1, use big words, 2, don't repeat yourself, and 3, be as literal as possible, with a lot of facts and a lot of numbers. Now, this is not merely bad advice, but it is actually the exact opposite of 25 centuries of proven wisdom. And that's why it took me 25 years to unlearn it. For the record, the right strategy to be persuasive is to use short words, repeat yourself again and again, and be figurative and metaphorical as much as possible. Now, you may ask, how did the physicist end up getting to study knowledge and learn about rhetoric? And the answer is I was lucky. I was raised by 2 writers. My mother was a writer and still is. My father was a newspaper editor for 30 years. So they gave me a love of language. And I actually published an essay on Hamlet back in 1988. And then I started writing a book on Hamlet, which morphed into a book on how Shakespeare uses the figures of speech to communicate meaning. And that led me to study rhetoric. And the thing about rhetoric is that the Greeks codified rhetoric from the great bards like Homer, who had to remember incredibly long epic poems And they wanted their audience to remember those poems too. So they developed a bunch of memory tricks: metaphor, puns, irony, and 36 figures of repetition from alliteration to rhyme. And for instance, if you're wondering why you had trouble getting this summer the song Call Me Maybe out of your head, it's got both rhyme and alliteration packed into those 3 words: call me maybe. The point is, this stuff works, and certainly all of the great lyricists are masters of the figures of speech. Now, so the simplest thing, if I could leave you with no other point, is that the key to being persuasive is to be memorable. And this may seem obvious, but it isn't taught in any single school anywhere. And you know, if you and social science has found that the reason why being memorable makes you more persuasive is the things that we recall easiest are the things we are most likely to believe are true. And that's why, you know, when during the O.J. trial, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. You remember that, you know, more than a decade later. And it's a powerful meme. Rhyme, it is a fact that things that rhyme are actually believed to be more true than things that don't rhyme. So you want to remember that you need to be memorable. So a little memory trick for how to remember the word memory is the word memory is like the word mammary. So you can picture in your mind, doesn't matter to me whether it's Scarlett Johansson or Matthew McConaughey, but one of those 2 images, and then you'll remember, oh, memory, I need to be memorable. It took me a long time. It took me over 20 years to write this book, and I realized only in the last few years not to put the word rhetoric in the title. In fact, I tried to sell this book for a very long time. I had a very good agent, and then I had another very good agent. In fact, I had John Irving's agent for a while, and then I had Bill McKibben's agent. But the word rhetoric is a kiss of death because everyone thinks they know what it means, and they don't. So I called it language intelligence instead of rhetoric. People think, for instance, rhetoric means using big words, $50 words. And the amazing thing is that the exact opposite is true. You know, the great speeches of the world, and this is something that Winston Churchill, who wrote a unpublished essay on rhetoric when he was 22, he said the great speeches are all built around short words because, quote, they appeal with a greater force. So we have judge not that ye be not judged, to be or not to be, and I have a dream from 3 of the greatest speeches of all time. It's also interesting, of course, that he titled his essay The Scaffolding of Rhetoric. That was a metaphor for saying that rhetoric is like a scaffolding. The point is you put a lot of effort into writing your speech, but when you're done, the scaffolding's gone, and hopefully people won't see. They won't have people like me pointing out what they're doing. And you heard 2 terrific speeches you know, before me, and they both used many examples of the figures. I will say that the book has some politics in it because I have lived in Washington, D.C. since I worked for the Clinton-Gore administration in the 1990s. As an aside, which is also a figure of speech, I learned when I was at the Department of Energy the definition of the word politics. It comes from the Greek poly meaning many and ticks meaning small blood-sucking insects. Perhaps the most useful piece of advice in the book comes from the political strategist Frank Luntz. And there's a simple rule. You say it again, and 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 then again, and again, and again, and again, and again. And about the time that you're absolutely sick of saying it is about the time that your target audience has heard it for the first time. And that is certainly something that the best politicians understand. It's certainly something advertisers understand, which is why you're always seeing the Energizer Bunny, or you're seeing the Aflac duck. Now I have a 6-year-old, so I understand that repetition is the primary strategy of society's true masters of getting what they want, which is small children. Now, it's interesting. Social scientists have found that repeating something 3 times has 90% the persuasive value of 3 different people saying it once. So yes, repetition, it does work. Another interesting study found that presidents who were judged to be the most charismatic used twice as many metaphors as non-charismatic presidents. Those of you old enough to remember Bill Clinton's 1996 acceptance speech, he talked about this vision for the future, we need to build a bridge to the 21st century. And he repeated that about 24 times in various forms in his speeches. Obama is not very metaphorical, unfortunately. It's probably his single biggest failing as a speaker is he just does not use a lot of metaphors, which is in some sense why he is not, I think, seen in some respects as the kind of visionary, transformational leader in some respects, like his idol, Ronald Reagan, who used a great many metaphors. My favorite figure of speech is the extended metaphor, which is a metaphor that's carried throughout an extended work, like, well, in this case, I have discussions of both Bad Romance and Poker Face from Lady Gaga. She didn't become the first artist to get 1 billion downloads on YouTube by accident. She is a world-class lyricist. And you know, her songs would definitely stand up to any scrutiny. You know, Bad Romance is a extended metaphor of love as a bad romance novel or movie, and it's got it's beautifully carried throughout the song. Poker Face, which is an even more sophisticated song, is an extended metaphor of love as a game of chance, particularly Texas Hold'em. Now, the one reason I'm delighted to be speaking to this audience is that I can finally talk about the oral sex that's in the book. It's certainly well known in the blogging world that if you could find a way to get oral sex into the headline of your blog, you would use your Facebook likes and retweets would go through the roof. But as a climate blogger, that's kind of a long stretch for me. Now, as it turns out, oral sex is not in the index for the book, so you can't just like, oh, I'm going to find where the oral sex is. No, you'll have to read it. I will give you a hint. It's in the chapter on the art of seduction, the figures of seduction. It's in fact all due to Lady Gaga Poker Face, because of course Poker Face is poke her face. And it is amazing that this amazes people. You can Google it. I read a quote from her. She was interviewed by MTV. She said, "It's funny because a lot of my fans were like, Gaga, Kanye West wrote a song, and it's not about what your record's about. Your record's about gambling, and this song is about dirty sex things." I said to them, "You're wrong. Kanye was right. That's exactly what this song is about." I will tell you that something which I left out of the book, but it's also true. It hardly appears anywhere online. But if you go home tonight and listen closely to Poker Face, Gaga doesn't always say poke her face. She uses another word in place of poke, and she gets away with it, and I think she is very pleased with the fact that she got away with it and that radio stations all over the world were repeating over and over again a well-known 4-letter word. But she does that a lot. She puts in a lot of double meanings, and it's, I think, one of the reasons why she's so popular. She appeals to the people who only thought Poker Face was about gambling, and to a more sophisticated crowd who saw that there was more in it. There's actually a figure of speech called enigma, which is being purposefully unclear. And it's actually, enigma is very widely used. There are many reasons to be unclear. Sometimes you don't want certain people to understand what you're saying. And of course, sometimes you want people to think you're more profound than you actually are. And so Jesus spoke in parables, I think, for obvious reasons. People like Bob Dylan was very cryptic in many of his lyrics, again, quite intentionally to appear more profound, I think. Now, for me, I really entered the communication space when I started blogging. And the great thing about blogging, which is why I'd recommend it to everyone, is that you get instant feedback. Most people who write do not get instant feedback. If you write a book, you get feedback a really long time later. Even my father, who was a newspaper editor, he would get feedback, in letters to the editor. But I get feedback in real time. I can find out instantly what works and what doesn't work. And you find out what gets retweets, what gets Facebook likes. And over time, you get better and better at it. And I don't think there's anything that can sort of beat that. I think that, my best blog post of the year, last year, had over 3,000 retweets and 41,000 Facebook likes, which means that the headline was probably read by more than 2 million people, which is actually pretty impressive for a blog that's just on climate change. I typically get Facebook likes and retweets comparable to the Washington Post and even sometimes Huffington Post. And again, it's not accidental. I have a long discussion of headlines in the book. The difference between a good blogger and a very good blogger is how much time they spend on headlines. And I've, in some sense, come to see the blog really as a headline delivery mechanism. And again, there's not much difference between blog headlines and tweets. I tweet out, all my headlines get tweeted out with a tiny URL. And again, you are trying to create memes. You're trying to create phrases that catch on. And if you pick up Bartlett's familiar quotations, 90% of the quotes in Bartlett's familiar quotations are the figures of speech. All the quotes that you remember are figures of speech. You just, it's just not taught. It's quite mind-boggling, actually. So you may wonder if you can, in fact, become more persuasive and memorable from a book. I think there's this myth that people are born that way, born with a gift of gab, but that isn't true. I've never, of all the people I write about in the book, not a single one of them didn't spend a great deal of time studying how to become better at communicating. As I said, Churchill wrote a whole essay on rhetoric when he was 22. And he wrote a novel which was semi-autobiographical, and he writes about his hero, who was an eloquent politician. These impromptu feats of oratory existed only in the minds of the listeners. The flowers of rhetoric were hothouse plants, by which he meant that they required close cultivation. They did not grow spontaneously. And one of his friends said he spent all of his life writing his impromptu remarks. And that was true. Bob Dylan, people think, Bob Dylan, he was born with this ability to speak this old American style that touched all of us. You can read his autobiography. He visited the New York Public Library again and again to read pre-Civil War newspapers. He went to the microfiche. He would read the newspapers from the 20 years before the Civil War because, quote, he was intrigued by the language and rhetoric of the times. He also studied the great lyricists like Hank Williams and such. I'm not saying he didn't have some sort of natural talent, but the fact is, didn't get it, his mastery of the English language just by some sort of gift of gab. And a few months after I gave him the book, I mentioned Van Jones. I don't know how many of you know of Van Jones. He was in a New Yorker profile, and I had seen in the profile that, and I'd always wondered, how was he such a great speaker? And the answer is that on his iPod, instead of jazz, he had the speeches of Martin Luther King and Churchill and Ronald Reagan, and he would listen to them over and over and over again. So I thought he'd like this manuscript of mine, which I had not succeeded in getting a publisher for 20 years. And a few months after I gave it to him, he came up to me and said, Joe, your book changed my life. And he had finally realized that all the things that he had picked up through osmosis and practice were, as he put it, secrets figured out centuries ago and later confirmed by science. Except they're not secrets. There were 1,000 books written on this subject during the Renaissance, so it can't really be called a secret. So I don't know if language intelligence will change your life. You'll have to read it and find out. The one Amazon reviewer said he is already getting more retweets. So let me just end by saying the point is there is a systematic way to be more persuasive and memorable. I won't say all my communications work. I wasn't trained in rhetoric. It's all self-taught. So you have to consciously try to do it. We all blurt out stuff without thinking. But I will say that, you know, the reason Bill Clinton is a successful speaker is because he uses the figures of speech. And anyone who uses them will become a more effective speaker. Think of it as verbal steroids, except they're safe and legal, and you won't get you thrown out of the Hall of Fame. And in fact, all the great speakers of all time, as I show in the book, use the figures of speech. So the question to ask, I'll leave you with, is how much is it worth to you to be more persuasive when you are trying to land that job that you want, or that must-have contract, or you're going out on that dream date and you want to impress that one person and leave an impression with them, which is to say, be memorable. How much is that worth if you want to stand out from the crowd, if you want to write killer lyrics, or if you just want to get retweeted more? And if the answer is that it's worth more than $15, then you are totally in luck today. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. These tricks were figured out 25 centuries ago, and they are right here in this book. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can take my mother's. Thank you. TV series. It will be a TV mini-series, maybe 6 to 8 hours on Showtime, and it will come out in about a year, and I think it'll be very exciting. And today, however, I'm here to try to persuade you to buy my book, Language Intelligence, Lessons on Persuasion from Jesus, Shakespeare, Lincoln, and Lady Gaga. Now, I should say that is normally the goal of I'm really very excited to be here, in part because finally I'll be able to give the R-rated version of this talk, which means that I've had to rewrite it considerably, and we'll be reading some of it, breaking some of the rules of public speaking, but just imagine, if you will, that this is the Democratic National Convention and there's a teleprompter and that I'm making eye contact with all of you while I'm speaking my talk. But since my mother is here, she will be at the table. She will hawk the book, and I don't have to try to persuade you to buy my book. I just have to try to persuade you to talk to her. And if she can't persuade you to buy the book, then Jesus, Shakespeare, Lincoln, and Lady Gaga combined could not. I will still need to persuade you to read the book once. I'm a native New Yorker. I was born and raised in Middletown, New York. Actually taught at Columbia University for a couple of years, worked at the Rockefeller Foundation, spent several years working for the Clinton-Gore administration at the Department of Energy, been blogging for the last 6 years, and as Julian mentioned, I'm working with James Cameron and some former 60 Minutes producers to actually do you buy it, because Lord knows we all buy a lot of books that we don't read anymore. And Van Jones, who's a great progressive communicator and a CNN analyst, gave me a great jacket quote for the book. This book changed my life, and it can change your life too. I do think that this book could change your life, but of course you'll have to buy it and read it first. Now, to figure out who in the audience could have their life